A heavy snow fell on the sleeping county of Devon one winter night. By morning, a deep and unsettling silence had been broken by something impossible. Residents awoke to find a single, continuous trail of cloven hoofprints stamped into the fresh snow, a trail that did not walk but seemed to flow over rooftops, through solid walls, and across frozen rivers for nearly 100 miles. This is the mystery of the Devil's Footprints. The night a wave of pure panic swept the English countryside. By the end of this story, you will have the tools to judge for yourself what creature or force could have created such an impossible path. We will examine frozen evidence, sift through terrified Victorian testimony, and weigh explanations ranging from escaped kangaroos to badgers and ball lightning. What would you believe if you found those prints outside your own door? To understand the sheer scale of the terror that followed, you must first step into the world that received this strange message. The year is 1855. Queen Victoria is on the throne. Charles Dickens is publishing his latest serial, and in the remote, rolling hills of South Devon, life is governed by the rhythms of the land. This is a place of isolated farmsteads, clustered villages, and deep, winding lanes. News travels at the speed of a horse, and the local newspaper might arrive days late. The people here are practical, hardworking, and intimately familiar with every track and trail for miles around. They are also, by the nature of their time and place, deeply connected to folklore and the old stories that whisper in the dark corners of the countryside. Superstition is not a distant concept, it is a quiet undercurrent to daily life. Then came the winter of 1855. It was a season of exceptional severity, a time when the cold bit deep and the world seemed to shrink in on itself. And on the night of February the 8th, a final, heavy snow began to fall. It was not a gentle dusting. It was a proper blanketing, a silent, relentless fall that smoothed over fields, buried hedgerows, and capped the thatched roofs of cottages. By morning on Friday, February the 9th, the world was transformed into a pristine, monochrome canvas, utterly silent and seemingly pure. This was the perfect stage, a clean slate upon which something would write a story that defied all logic. The deep, unbroken snow meant that any creature moving through it would leave a clear record of its passage, and that is precisely what the people of Devon discovered when they opened their doors. They found a record, but it was one that made no earthly sense at all. The first person to see them was likely a farmer, stepping out into the brittle cold to tend his animals. His eyes would have scanned the fresh snow, expecting the familiar scatter of rabbit tracks or the delicate stitchwork of a bird. Instead, he saw a single, unbroken line. It marched straight across his yard, a neat sequence of marks punched deep into the snow. He would have bent closer, his breath clouding in the air. Each print was distinct, shaped almost like a small hoof, roughly 4 inches long. And they were spaced with an unnerving regularity, about 8 inches apart, as if whatever made them had moved with a mechanical, unhurried pace. His initial curiosity would have curdled into something colder. He might have called to his wife. A neighbor looking from his own door would have seen the same trail, and they would have begun to follow it. This is how the panic began, not with a scream, but with a slow, dawning realization that the rules of the world had changed overnight. The trail did not meander like the path of a searching animal. It was relentless, direct, and utterly indifferent to the obstacles in its way. People gathered in small, murmuring groups, their boots crunching in the snow as they traced the prints. The trail led up to the high wall of a garden, and instead of stopping or turning, the prints simply continued on the other side, as if the wall were not there. It approached the side of a house, and the marks were found on the sloping thatch of the roof, then again in the snow on the ground beyond it, as if the creature had stepped over the entire building. At the banks of the river Exe and other streams now locked in ice, the line marched straight across the frozen surface, never deviating. Word spread from farm to village, from village to town, carried by breathless messengers on horseback. The local constable was summoned, a man of practical authority now facing an utterly impractical problem. He would have measured the prints, noted their spacing, and followed the trail until even his rational mind could offer no explanation. Clergymen examined the marks, their faces grave. The hoof-like shape was the detail that sealed the collective dread. In the iconography of the time, in the sermons preached from pulpits every Sunday, who else left the mark of a cloven hoof? The whispers started in the markets and the public houses. The devil himself had taken a walk through Devon. By midday, the entire region was in the grip of a profound and infectious fear. Parents kept their children tightly indoors. Men ventured out with whatever they could use as a weapon, from walking sticks to old muskets, their eyes scanning the white landscape not for a fox or a badger, but for something altogether more biblical. The normal sounds of a rural morning were swallowed by a tense, watching silence, broken only by the low murmur of terrified speculation. The pristine snow, a symbol of purity just hours before, was now a cursed ledger recording a visitation from a realm beyond understanding. The physical evidence was undeniable, etched into the very landscape, and it pointed to a single, terrifying conclusion. Something impossible had passed among them, and no one knew where it had come from or where it had gone. The sheer geographical spread of these prints was what transformed a local oddity into a regional legend. To trace their reported path is to draw a frantic, impossible line across the map of South Devon. Starting near the mouth of the River Ixie, the trail was said to have come ashore as if from the sea itself. It then struck inland with a bizarre, zigzagging purpose. Witnesses tracked it through the coastal towns of Exmouth and Teignmouth, where it stamped across docks and main streets alike, but it did not stay by the shore. The line turned north, pushing deep into the countryside, touching villages like Dawlish and then climbing toward Totnes, a town steeped in its own ancient history. In all, the path described a staggering circuit. Estimates of its total length vary from a conservative 40 miles to an almost unbelievable 100. Think of that distance. It is the equivalent of a single set of footprints walking from the heart of London all the way to the city of Cambridge, without a single pause, without a single detour, in one single night. This was not the foraging path of a lost animal. An animal would double back, would circle, would stop to dig or eat. This trail was a straight line, punctuated only by those impossible leaps over obstacles. It gave the overwhelming impression of a single-minded traveler, a being with a destination in mind, covering this immense distance between dusk and dawn. The logistics are baffling. To walk 100 miles in, say, 10 hours of darkness would require a consistent pace of 10 miles per hour. That is a steady, brisk jog for a human, sustained without rest for an entire night. But this was no human jogger. This was something leaving deep, distinct hoofprints in snow, maintaining that exact 8-inch spacing mile after mile after mile. The continuity was the most haunting detail of all. In village after village, the prints were identical. The same size, the same shape, the same relentless spacing. It felt like the entire county had been stitched together by one unbroken nocturnal patrol. This was not a series of separate events, but one continuous event witnessed in fragments by terrified people along its route. The map does not lie. Something or someone undertook a monumental journey across Devon that night, and every step it took was a physical challenge to reality. But what exactly were people looking at in the snow? Let's zoom in on the physical evidence, the cold, hard facts stamped into that February frost. The prints themselves were described with remarkable consistency by those who saw them. They were cloven, meaning split down the middle, much like the hoof of a donkey or a goat. Each impression was roughly 4 inches long, and they were sunk deep into the snowpack, suggesting the creature that made them carried a significant weight, perhaps that of a large dog or a small pony. Yet it was not the shape or the depth that caused the most confusion, it was the behavior of the trail. The prints were spaced with an unnerving, almost mechanical precision. They fell exactly 8 inches apart in a single, unwavering line. There were no signs of a second set of tracks, no companion, no wandering. This was a solitary traveler with a perfectly metronomic gait. An animal, even a disciplined one, would show some variation, a slight stumble, a pause, a change in stride. This trail showed none of that. It was as if a single, heavy stamp had been pressed into the snow at perfectly measured intervals for mile after mile. This perfect regularity stripped the prints of any natural rhythm, making them feel less like a record of a living creature and more like the imprint of a machine or a force moving with a purpose beyond understanding. And then there were the locations. This is where the witness accounts truly defy explanation. The trail did not respect the world as we know it. It was found leading directly up to the vertical stone wall of a country estate, and then continuing unbroken on the other side with no marks on the wall itself. In several villages, the prints marched straight to the side of a cottage, only to be found again on the pure, snow-covered thatch of the roof, and then once more in the yard on the far side, as if the maker had simply stepped over the entire building. There were reports of the line approaching a solid haystack, appearing to go directly through its center and emerging in a straight line on the opposite side. Frozen rivers presented no barrier, the tracks marching across the ice without deviation. This was the core of the supernatural terror. The footprints were not just an unknown animal track, they were a physical paradox. They presented evidence of a being that moved through the human world while ignoring its most fundamental rules. Walls, roofs, and solid stacks of hay were not obstacles, they were mere suggestions. The creature, whatever it was, seemed to operate on a different plane of reality, one where our barriers were invisible or simply irrelevant. This anatomical breakdown of the mystery only deepens it. You are left with a set of clear, observable facts that, when combined, create something utterly impossible. A heavy, cloven-hoofed creature that walked 100 miles in a straight line in one night with a robotically even stride and passed through solid matter. The evidence itself seemed to point away from the natural world and toward something else entirely. The terror of that morning was not confined to whispers, it was printed in black and white for the entire nation to read. Just days after the event, the prestigious Times of London published a letter from a correspondent in Devon, detailing the extraordinary phenomenon. It described the footprints as having the appearance of a donkey's shoe, and noted their perplexing path over roofs and walls, stating the marks passed through gardens and courtyards, leaving walls and locked gates untouched. This was no longer a rural rumor, it was a documented mystery in the paper of record. Local publications were filled with even more vivid first-hand accounts. One farmer, interviewed by the Western Luminary, insisted he had followed the trail to a hayrick, a solid stack of hay, where the prints vanished directly into one side and reappeared in perfect order on the other, as if the creature had walked straight through it. Servants in large country houses spoke in hushed tones of finding the tracks leading right up to the very doors of their kitchens, a detail that felt deeply personal and invasive. But perhaps the most compelling witness was a man of both faith and reason, the Reverend H.T. Ellacombe. As the vicar of Clist St. George, he was a respected community leader, not prone to superstition. In his own garden, a place of quiet reflection, he found the unmistakable trail. He later wrote of the prints being in a single line, about 8 inches apart, and of their perfect formation even when passing over a high wall. His testimony carried immense weight. If a man of the cloth could not explain these marks as the work of a common animal, what hope did anyone else have? The general consensus among the populace was swift and chilling. In pubs and market squares, the conclusion was unanimous. The devil himself had taken a nocturnal stroll through their county. This was not a metaphor, it was a deeply held belief. The cloven hoof was his signature, the indifference to physical barriers proof of his supernatural nature. The fear was so palpable it had a physical effect on daily life. For days, people refused to go out after dark. evening church services were poorly attended as families huddled together behind locked doors. Normal work in the field slowed to a crawl as men ventured out only in nervous groups, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The very landscape they knew so well had become a place of hidden menace, every pristine snowdrift a potential page from a diabolical ledger. The footprints had not just crossed the land, they had crossed into the psyche of an entire community, leaving a deeper impression than any ice or snow ever could. With the evidence laid bare and terror gripping the countryside, the hunt for an explanation began in earnest. The first and most visceral answer came from the pulpit and the pews. For many, the cloven hoofprint was not a puzzle to be solved, but a message to be understood. This was the devil's work, a literal demonic visitation. In the minds of a Victorian populace steeped in religious imagery, it made a dreadful kind of sense. The creature's indifference to walls and roofs mirrored the supernatural ability to pass through matter. Its immense, single-minded journey suggested a dark survey of the land, perhaps a census of souls. Preachers pointed to the event as a sign of divine warning, a call to repentance. The theory was emotionally satisfying for its simplicity, but it left practical questions unanswered. If it was the devil, why leave only footprints? Where was the fire, the brimstone, the tangible mischief? The visitation seemed oddly passive, a silent walk rather than a dramatic assault. Yet, in the absence of any better idea, the diabolical explanation held powerful sway, coloring the memories of every witness. As the initial shock subsided, more earthly minds began to propose alternatives, each striving to fit the impossible facts into the known world. Some looked to the skies, suggesting a giant, unknown bird had made the tracks, its strange gait creating the single line. But no bird native to England could account for the weight, the depth, or the consistent hoof-like shape. A more exotic idea quickly took flight. The British aristocracy had a fondness for private menageries, and rumors swirled that a kangaroo had escaped from a nearby estate. The theory was that the marsupial's powerful hind legs and hopping motion could create a single line of paired impressions that might, in melted or distorted snow, look like a continuous trail. It was a creative guess, but it stumbled on the details. A kangaroo's prints would show the distinct marks of a tail drag, and its hopping would cover many feet with each bound, not a mere 8 inches. The spacing was all wrong for a leap, and the prints were described as hoof marks, not paw prints. Other suggestions ventured into the realm of the absurdly small. Could a chain of hopping mice or voles have created the illusion? Perhaps one after another they bounded through the snow, each landing in the previous creature's print. While charming, this idea collapses under the sheer scale and precision required. Coordinating hundreds of thousands of tiny rodents across 100 miles of varied terrain, maintaining a perfectly straight line over walls and rivers, is a feat more miraculous than the original mystery. Finally, a more mechanical theory emerged from the age of invention. Could it have been an experimental balloon, perhaps a weather device or early prototype, trailing a shackle or a chain on a rope? As the balloon drifted with the wind, the object at the end might tap the snow at regular intervals. This could explain the single line, the spacing, and the ability to cross obstacles high above the ground. Yet again, the evidence resists. The prints were described as deep and weighty, not light taps. They showed a clear, cloven shape, not the round or V-shaped mark of a dragging metal object. And the trail's intricate path through narrow lanes and over specific rooftops suggests a guidance far more precise than the whim of a winter breeze. Each theory, from the infernal to the zoological to the mechanical, shone a different light on the mystery, only to reveal new shadows. The public was caught between a terrifying supernatural answer and a series of rational ones that felt hopelessly inadequate. This chasm between what people saw and what they could explain is where true legend is born. The lack of a clear, satisfying answer did not diminish the devil's footprints, it immortalized them. It meant the mystery remained alive, open for anyone to examine and wonder. Into this storm of superstition stepped the voice of Victorian science, determined to restore order with reason. Leading naturalists of the day, men who had classified unknown species from across the globe, found the diabolical explanation not just fanciful, but an affront to rational inquiry. Foremost among them was Sir Richard Owen, the celebrated anatomist who famously coined the word dinosaur. A man who had reconstructed giant lizards from fossil fragments was not about to be spooked by footprints in the snow. He publicly dismissed the supernatural claims, urging a calm examination of the natural world for an answer. The scientific community rallied to this call, and their proposed solutions were models of grounded thinking. They looked to local wildlife, searching for a creature whose tracks could be mistaken for the infamous prints under the right conditions. One strong candidate was the badger. A heavy, lumbering animal with a distinctive gait, a badger's fore and hind prints can sometimes overlap in deep snow, creating a single, dragging line of marks. If the snow was in a particular state of partial melt and refreeze, these blurred tracks could theoretically take on a more defined, hoof-like appearance. Another proposal pointed to the otter. These playful mammals often move with a bounding, loping motion, and in wet, slushy snow, their paired prints could merge into a continuous trail, especially if they were following a scent or a habitual path along a riverbank that later froze. Even the common hare was suggested, its powerful hind legs landing ahead of its forepaws in a run, potentially creating a staggered line of impressions. But the most intriguing natural hypothesis did not involve an animal at all. Some scientists proposed a phenomenon known as ice shattering or snow melt. The idea was that a unique combination of weather events could create the prints without any creature present. Imagine a thick layer of snow with a hard, icy crust on top. If a sudden thaw began from below, perhaps from warmer ground, the snowpack could collapse in a specific way. As sections of the icy crust fell into the softened layer beneath, they might leave a series of roughly circular, punched-out holes. If the thaw was consistent and the snow structure just right, these holes could appear in a remarkably straight line, marching across the landscape. Wind could then sculpt the edges of these holes, perhaps giving them a more elongated or cloven shape. This was a clever attempt to explain the prints as a freak geological event, a trick of physics and weather. Yet, for all their ingenuity, each of these scientific theories stumbled when held against the full weight of the witness reports. The badger or otter theory could not account for the sheer, unbroken 100-mile distance. No single animal travels that far in one night without foraging, resting, or deviating. The perfect 8-inch spacing was unlike any animal's natural, variable stride. Most damningly, these creatures do not walk over rooftops or through solid hayricks. The ice-shattering hypothesis, while fascinating, faced its own hurdles. Could such a perfect, spontaneous process really replicate a hoof-shaped impression not just once but thousands of times in a row? And how could it possibly operate with such precision over walls and across rivers, places where the snow cover and ground temperature would be completely different? The scientists had provided possible explanations for individual aspects of the mystery, but none could synthesize all the elements, the shape, the spacing, the distance, and the impossible topography into one coherent natural cause. The gap between observation and explanation remained, leaving the door to legend firmly ajar. Of all the natural explanations, one creature emerged as a surprisingly strong suspect: the humble European badger. This stout, nocturnal animal, a common resident of the English countryside, possesses the exact kind of footprint that could, under the right circumstances, start a panic. A badger's front paw leaves a broad, almost hand-like print with 5 distinct claw marks, while its hind paw is longer and narrower. When it walks, its hind foot often lands almost directly in the track left by its front foot, a gait known as direct register. Now imagine a night of heavy snowfall followed by a slight morning thaw, creating a thin, crisp crust over a soft, slushy layer beneath. A badger lumbering across this surface would not leave 4 clean prints. Its heavy body would break through the fragile crust, its front paw would punch a hole, its following hind paw, landing in nearly the same spot, would widen and distort that hole, smearing the details. What you would be left with is not a clear paw print, but a single, elongated, somewhat messy impression in the snow. If the crust was just right, the collapse could even pinch the middle of this impression, creating a vaguely cloven or split appearance. A line of these distorted, overlapping tracks, viewed by a frightened person from a standing height, could very easily be misinterpreted as a sequence of neat, cloven hoofprints. The theory is elegant in its simplicity. It uses a common local animal and a plausible weather condition to explain the core visual, the hoof-like mark in the snow. It also accounts for the single line, as the badger's direct register gait creates a trail that looks like a single set of prints, not 2. For many modern investigators, this has become the go-to rational answer, a tidy bit of forensic zoology that seems to sweep away the supernatural. But does the badger theory really hold up under the full weight of the mystery? The weaknesses become apparent when we move from a single set of tracks in a garden to the epic scale of the event. First, consider the distance. The reported trail spanned up to 100 miles. A badger is a creature of habit with a well-defined territory it patrols nightly for food. Its home range is typically less than 1 square mile. The idea of a single badger embarking on a non-stop 100-mile marathon in one night, never stopping to dig for worms, never deviating to investigate a scent, is biologically absurd. It would be an unprecedented feat of endurance with no purpose. You could argue it was a chain of many different badgers, each leaving a segment of the trail within its own territory. But this introduces an even greater improbability. It would require dozens, perhaps hundreds, of individual badgers to all decide to take a long, straight-line walk on the same night, in the same direction, and for their individual tracks to perfectly align end to end across fences, rivers, and property lines without a single gap or curve. The coordination required makes the idea of one diabolical traveler seem almost more reasonable. Furthermore, the badger's gait, while creating a single line, does not produce prints with the reported mechanical precision. A badger's stride varies, it weaves, it pauses. The devil's footprints were described as having a perfect, unvarying 8-inch spacing, a rhythm more like a metronome than an animal. And then we return to the impossible geography, the rooftops and walls. Even the most determined marathon-running badger cannot walk through a solid hayrick or step over a 2-story cottage. The badger theory brilliantly explains what the prints might have looked like in isolation on a flat field, but it completely unravels when asked to explain where they were found. It solves the shape of the mystery, but not its staggering scope or its defiance of physics. This is the recurring trap for every rational explanation. They can illuminate a piece of the puzzle, but the complete picture remains stubbornly, fascinatingly out of reach. Another theory shrinks the suspect down to the size of a field mouse. If a badger seemed too small to cover the distance, perhaps a creature even smaller could explain the trail's precision. This is the hopping rodent hypothesis. Picture a tiny vole or wood mouse startled from its burrow on that snowy night. Its natural method of movement across an open, treacherous field is not a walk, but a series of frantic, bounding leaps. Each jump would land it in a small, round depression in the snow. If a whole population of these rodents was active that night, perhaps driven by hunger or a shared instinct, their individual leaps could, in theory, create a dotted line of tiny craters stretching for some distance. Now introduce the subtle alchemy of weather. As the morning sun rises, it doesn't just melt snow, it can cause sublimation where ice turns directly to water vapor. This process can subtly reshape the edges of those tiny holes. The warm sun could soften the crisp rims, causing them to slump inward. neighboring depressions very close together might merge as the walls between them collapse. What began as a dotted line of separate mouse hops could, through this melting and merging, become a continuous trough-like impression in the snow. From a distance or to a panicked eye, this softened, continuous groove could be misinterpreted as a single line of connected hoofprints. It is a clever idea that uses the power of perception and natural erosion to solve the shape of the mystery. But does the math of a mouse's life match the legend? Consider the reported stride, that perfect 8-inch spacing. A field mouse's maximum leap might be a foot on solid ground, but in deep, powdery snow, its progress would be severely hampered. Its leaps would be shorter, more frantic, and far less regular. The idea of thousands of mice over 100 miles all maintaining an identical 8-inch hop is a biological fantasy. More critically, think of the depth. The devil's footprints were described as being punched deep into the snow, suggesting a creature of substantial weight. The lightest touch of a mouse would leave the faintest of traces, a delicate scratch on the surface, not a deep, weighty stamp. Even after melting, those impressions would become shallow puddles, not defined hoof-shaped holes. And once again, this theory collides with the impossible geography. However many mice you enlist, their coordinated line would still need to scale a vertical garden wall, march across a thatched roof, and proceed in perfect order across a frozen river. The hopping rodent hypothesis elegantly explains how a line in the snow might appear, but it cannot explain where that line was found. It turns the mystery from a question of a single creature into a question of mass rodent coordination on an impossible scale, which only deepens the puzzle it seeks to solve. Perhaps the answer was not in the earth, but in the air itself. As the 19th century progressed, a new kind of science was learning to read the sky, and it offered a different set of suspects for the Devon mystery. Investigators began to look upward to the realm of strange electrical and atmospheric phenomena that were only beginning to be understood. One compelling idea centered on ball lightning, that rare and baffling weather event where a glowing sphere of energy seems to drift erratically near the ground. Could a ball of charged plasma skimming just above the snow-covered landscape have created the trail? The theory suggests that as it moved, its intense, localized heat might have melted perfect, circular divots into the snowpack below it. If it traveled in a straight line, these melted spots could appear as a sequence of prints. This could even explain the trail's indifference to walls and roofs, as ball lightning is famously reported to pass through solid matter like walls or window panes. Yet the shape remains a problem. Ball lightning would likely create round, scorched impressions, not the distinct cloven hoof marks described by so many. And while its path can be straight, it is more often described as chaotic and wandering, not the relentless, mile-consuming march witnessed in Devon. Another meteorological culprit proposed was a localized, ground-hugging whirlwind, a kind of miniature tornado. Such a vortex, dancing along a specific path, could theoretically press into the snow with enough force to create a dashed line of depressions. The spinning motion might even sculpt the snow in a way that created a split or elongated shape. This idea elegantly accounts for the trail's ability to appear over obstacles, as a small whirlwind could easily jump a wall or cross a rooftop. But again, the perfection of the prints works against it. A whirlwind's touch would be messy and irregular, scouring the snow rather than stamping it with neat, identical marks. Its path would be meandering, not laser straight for 100 miles. Then there is the enchanting idea of snow rollers. These are rare natural formations like snowy tumbleweeds, created when a perfect combination of wind, temperature, and snow consistency occurs. A loose piece of snow gets caught by the wind, rolls across a snowy field, and gathers more snow around it, leaving behind a distinctive, continuous trough in its wake. Under very specific conditions, a series of these could form in a line. To a frightened eye at dawn, such a trough might be misread as a trail of footprints. It is a beautiful, almost poetic explanation, turning panic into a simple act of wind and physics. But snow rollers are typically found on open, windswept hillsides, not in enclosed gardens on rooftops or traversing frozen rivers. They also create a smooth, U-shaped channel, not a sequence of individual hoof-shaped stamps. This shift in thinking from searching for a creature to analyzing the weather was a profound moment. It represented the Victorian mind at a crossroads, trying to wrench folklore into the age of empirical science. They were applying the new tools of meteorology to an old, terrifying story. Yet, for all their ingenuity, each weather-based theory, like the animal ones before it, could only explain a fragment of the whole. Ball lightning might account for the prints on a roof, but not their perfect shape. A whirlwind might explain the straight line, but not its 100-mile discipline. Snow rollers might explain a trail in a field, but not its path through a hayrick. The scientific explanations were like pieces from different puzzles, none of which fit the complete, bizarre picture left in the snow. This failure was not a defeat for reason, but it did something perhaps more important. It guaranteed the mystery's survival. When every rational answer proves incomplete, the story is free to breathe on its own, forever suspended between fact and legend. Fear is a contagion that spreads faster than any footprint. While the marks themselves were a physical puzzle, their true power lay in the psychological shockwave they sent through Victorian society. This was not merely a mystery, it was a textbook case of mass hysteria erupting in a world without telephones or television. Imagine the information vacuum of 1855. In isolated villages, news arrived via the breathless account of a neighbor or the weekly paper. When something this bizarre occurred, there was no official statement, no police bulletin to provide facts and quell rumors. The story propagated through the oldest and most potent network, human conversation, and with each retelling it grew more terrifying. A simple line in the snow at a farm in Topsham became, by the time it reached a pub in Exeter, a trail of smoking hoofprints leading to the church door. This was the anatomy of a panic. It began with a genuine, shared experience, the undeniable prints, but the lack of an immediate, rational explanation created a fertile void, and into that void rushed the most primal human fears, dressed in the religious imagery of the era. The devil was a concrete figure in the Victorian mind, a very real spiritual adversary. The cloven hoof was not a symbol, it was a calling card. Therefore, the conclusion was not a leap of logic for many, it was the only logic that fit their worldview. The panic manifested in tangible changes to daily life. Normal routines of rural existence ground to a halt. Farmers hesitated to tend to distant fields. Mothers kept children from playing outside, even in the daylight. Evening travel, already difficult in the deep snow, became virtually non-existent as families barred their doors against the gathering dark, listening for a telltale crunch in the snow that never came. The local newspapers, like the Western Luminary and the Exeter Flying Post, did not just report the event, they amplified it. Their pages were filled with dramatic, first-hand accounts from respectable citizens, clergymen, and constables, giving official credence to the rumors. Then, the ultimate validation, the Times of London picked up the story. Suddenly, the strange happenings in a remote English county were national news, discussed in London clubs and read about in parlours across the country. The event transformed from a local scare into a national sensation, a shared piece of folklore in the making. In many ways, the Devil's Footprints episode is a Victorian precursor to a modern viral mystery or moral panic. The core ingredients are identical: a strange, triggering event, a media ecosystem that magnifies it, a public hungry for an explanation, and the rapid crystallization of a narrative that feels true because it resonates with deeper cultural anxieties. Today, that anxiety might be about technology or societal change. Then, it was about divine judgment and the supernatural. The footprints provided the physical evidence, but it was the human mind, in all its suggestibility and need for narrative, that constructed the terror. The snow melted, but the story, forged in that perfect storm of fear and fascination, was permanently stamped into history. The power of the press in 1855 cannot be overstated. In an age before radio or moving pictures, the newspaper was the primary window to the wider world, and it was through this window that the devil's footprints truly entered the national consciousness. Publications like the Illustrated London News did not merely report the event, they dramatized it. They presented the story with bold, sensational headlines that framed the mystery not as a curious puzzle, but as a genuine supernatural visitation. But the most potent tool was not the text, it was the image. For a largely illiterate or semi-literate public, a detailed engraving was worth 1,000 whispered rumors. These illustrations showed terrified families peering from their cottage windows at a line of sinister prints marching across their snowy yard. They depicted the trail scaling impossible walls and crossing frozen rivers under a bleak, moonlit sky. The imagery was stark, emotive, and instantly understandable. It transformed an abstract report from Devon into a vivid, visual nightmare that could be consumed in parlors and coffee houses across Britain. This was not objective journalism, it was storytelling of the highest order, and it sold papers by the thousands. The press performed a dual role, acting as both chronicler and catalyst. By giving the story such prominent, illustrated space, they validated the fears of the locals. If the great London papers were talking about it, then it must be profoundly, undeniably real. Simultaneously, they amplified those fears for a national audience who had no direct experience of the event, feeding a hunger for the strange and macabre that Victorian readers dearly loved. Details were inevitably smoothed, sharpened, or exaggerated in the retelling. A farmer's confused account of tracks near a wall became, in print, a definitive account of the prints passing through it. The sheer scale of the trail was often presented as established fact, not a collection of disparate reports. This cycle of reporting and re-reporting, each time with a slightly more dramatic flourish, cemented the legend in the public mind long after the snow had melted. The mystery was no longer just about what happened in Devon. It was a shared national narrative, a piece of collective folklore manufactured in part by the steam-powered printing press. In doing so, the Victorian media ensured the Devil's Footprints would not be forgotten as a local winter's tale, but would endure as a legendary question mark for over 150 years. The leap from strange tracks to a diabolical visitor was not a random guess, but a reflex born from centuries of storytelling. To understand why the people of Devon saw the devil in the snow, you must step into the deep, dark woods of English folklore. For generations, long before newspapers or national roads, communities made sense of the unexplainable through shared tales. The figure of the devil was not a distant theological concept, but a vivid local character. He was a trickster, a tempter, and a very real presence in the landscape. In these stories, he was almost always described as leaving the mark of a cloven hoof, a direct inversion of the pure, unblemished foot of the saint. This imagery was carved into the very culture, from the mystery plays performed in market squares to the warnings muttered by grandmothers at the hearth. The physical world was dotted with his supposed handiwork. All across Britain, you can find places named for him, like the Devil's Dyke or the Devil's Punch Bowl, natural features so awe-inspiring or oddly formed that folklore credited them to a single, mighty stamp of his hoof or a scoop of his fiery hand. When the Victorians of Devon looked at those prints, they weren't just seeing marks in snow, they were reading a page from their oldest, most instinctual book. They were recognizing a signature they had been taught to fear since childhood. This was a society living in a profound moment of transition. The Industrial Revolution was steaming ahead, with railways cutting through the countryside and factories rising in cities. Science was making incredible leaps, promising to explain the mechanics of the universe. Yet in the remote villages and farmsteads, the old world persisted. The age of reason had not fully banished the age of superstition, it merely layered over it. For every gentleman in London reading Darwin, there was a farmer in Devon who still knew the proper chant to bless his livestock or the specific day when it was bad luck to mend fences. The night was still a realm of unknown sounds and shapes, and the church, a central pillar of community life, consistently reinforced the reality of spiritual warfare. So when an event occurred that defied every practical explanation their farming knowledge could provide, that cultural script flipped open automatically. The prints did not just tap into a fear of the supernatural, they activated a specific, pre-existing narrative. It was a story that gave a terrifying but familiar shape to the formless unknown. The incident proved that beneath the veneer of Victorian progress and propriety, those deep-seated cultural currents still flowed with immense power, waiting for just the right trigger to pull them to the surface. The snow of 1855 melted, but the footprints refused to fade from history. As the 20th century dawned, the mystery was no longer a matter of local panic, but a permanent fixture in the catalogue of the unexplained, a challenge thrown down to every new generation of skeptics and researchers. The case demanded a more forensic approach, one that could separate the layered frost of legend from the hard ground of fact. This task fell to investigators like writer and historian Mike Dash, who in the 1990s undertook a meticulous re-examination. He did not chase ghosts, he chased paper trails, digging through archived copies of local newspapers, parish records, and long-forgotten letters in the British Library. His goal was to strip away a century of accumulated storytelling and see what the Victorians themselves actually said in the cold light of that February morning. What he found was both clarifying and confounding. The core event was undeniable, reported by multiple credible sources across a wide area. However, the most extreme details, the prints passing through solid hayricks or marching over two-story homes, were far less common in the earliest accounts than later retellings suggested. Some of these impossible feats might have been exaggerations that grew in the telling, or honest misinterpretations of tracks that simply went up to a wall and reappeared on the other side after the creature had found a way around. Dash's work provided a crucial service. It grounded the phenomenon in a specific time and place with reliable witnesses, while also showing how quickly even a real event can be sculpted by fear and fascination into something even stranger. Yet, even when pared down to its most verified elements, the mystery retained its essential puzzle, a very long, very odd trail that a lot of sensible people could not explain. This rigorous groundwork invited a new wave of experimentation. If the badger theory seemed promising, why not test it? Modern investigators have actually tried. They've observed badgers moving in fresh, deep snow, studying how their gait distorts the prints. The results are intriguing, showing how a line of messy, overlapping holes could, from a distance, resemble a single file of marks. But these recreations never quite match the reported scale or the uncanny regularity. No badger in any study has walked 100-mile straight line overnight. Other attempts have looked to the weather, using modern meteorological knowledge to model the possibility of a rare, rolling electrical discharge or a sustained whirlwind. Computer simulations can show how such phenomena might create a dashed line, but the leap from a simulated dash to a reported cloven hoof remains a vast one. The most telling outcome of all this modern scrutiny is not a solution but a stalemate. Every theory, from the zoological to the meteorological to the psychological, finds its passionate advocates and its critical flaws. The badger explains the shape but not the distance. The ball lightning might explain the roof but not the perfect prints. The mass hysteria explains the fear but not the initial physical evidence that triggered it. In the end, the devil's footprints have resisted a final, tidy classification. They sit in that fascinating borderland where history meets mystery, a case file that remains stubbornly open. This enduring ambiguity is perhaps the greatest legacy of that winter's night, a reminder that some stories are so perfectly strange they forever escape the cage of a single explanation. Human mischief is a suspect we cannot ignore. Before we assign the event to demons or freak weather, we must ask the most human question of all: what if someone did this on purpose? The idea of a grand, coordinated hoax is tantalizing. It appeals to our love of a clever trick, a story where the punchline is the panic of an entire county. Imagine the bravado of the prankster creeping through the frozen night with a strange stamp on a stick, carefully planting each impossible print. The motivation is easy to conjure: perhaps a bored aristocrat with too much time and money, a local craftsman with a grudge, or simply someone with a wicked sense of humor who wanted to see how far a story could travel. The legend itself would be the ultimate goal: to create something so bizarre it would outlive its creator. Yet when we move from the romantic idea to the practical execution, the theory begins to crumble under its own weight. The scale is the first and greatest obstacle. Creating a trail of even 40 miles, let alone 100, in a single winter night is a logistical nightmare. The prankster would need to cover the distance on foot in deep snow at a pace fast enough to finish before dawn. They would have to carry their stamping tool, which would need to be durable enough to make thousands of identical impressions without breaking or wearing down. They would need an intimate, encyclopedic knowledge of the entire route, knowing exactly where every wall, every river, and every rooftop lay, to plan those impossible leaps convincingly. And they would have to do all of this in absolute secrecy, in a landscape where sound travels far on a cold, silent night, without leaving a single human footprint beside the cloven ones, and without being seen by any early riser or night watchman. The coordination required for multiple people makes the plot even more fragile. More conspirators means more chances for a mistake, a loose tongue, or a stray boot print in the wrong place. The silence of history is also telling. In the 170 years since, no deathbed confession has emerged, no hidden diary has been found detailing the great Devon prank. In a community where gossip was a primary pastime, it seems nearly impossible that such a large secret could have been kept by so many for so long. While the hoax theory is largely dismissed by serious researchers due to these mountainous practical problems, it serves a vital purpose in our investigation. It adds a crucial layer of intrigue about human nature itself. It reminds us that our desire for an explanation is so strong we will entertain even the most arduous scenarios, and that the line between a supernatural legend and an epic human joke is sometimes drawn only by the limits of our endurance. The very fact that we must seriously consider a plot of such outrageous scale speaks to the profound strangeness at the heart of the event, a strangeness that pushes us to imagine the limits of human ingenuity just as much as it pushes us to imagine the limits of the natural world. The most stubborn challenge lies not in the shape or distance of the prints, but in their impossible geography. Those walls, roofs, and rivers are the jagged rocks upon which every tidy theory ultimately crashes. Let's walk up to one of those garden walls just as a Victorian witness did. The prints approach the vertical stone face, and then, according to several accounts, they are found continuing in a perfect line on the other side. No marks scale the wall, no scratches suggest a climb. The line simply appears to pass through it. Now, a rational mind immediately seeks a gap, a low spot, a hidden gate. Perhaps there was a drain at the base of the wall, a small tunnel where a determined animal could have squeezed through, leaving the snow on top undisturbed. This is entirely possible, and later storytellers may have transformed a mundane scramble through a hole into a miraculous passage. Yet the psychological impact in that moment was absolute. To a person standing in the silent snow, following a trail that led directly to an unbroken barrier, only to find it resume seamlessly beyond, the effect was one of pure impossibility. It felt like a violation of physics, a taunt. The same logic applies to the famous rooftops. Prints were reported on the thatch of cottages, could a heavy animal actually climb a snow-covered, sloping roof without slipping, leaving a neat trail, and then descend the other side? It strains belief. A more likely scenario involves the peculiar way snow collects and melts. A heavy snowfall driven by wind can create deep drifts on the leeward side of a roof's ridge. As the sun rises, sections of this snow might slide off or melt in patches. Could the collapse of a snow drift over the edge of a roof or the drip line from a gutter create a series of depressions in the snowbank below that, from a certain angle, looked like prints leading to and from the house? It is a stretch, but perception under panic is a powerful lens. The frozen rivers present a different but equally potent puzzle. The prints marched straight across the ice. This is less supernatural than it first appears, as many animals cross frozen streams, but it contributes to the overarching narrative of an unstoppable direct force. When you combine these three elements, the cumulative effect is devastating to any single natural explanation. A badger might find a hole under a wall. An otter might cross a frozen river, but no single animal does all these things in one continuous marathon journey. The true power of these details is their collective weight. They create a composite picture of a traveler that moved through the human landscape as if our fences and homes were mere sketches on a map, irrelevant to its path. This is why the mystery endures. We can explain away each individual impossibility with a possible, if unlikely, natural cause, a hidden hole, a melting illusion, a common animal path. But asking one creature or one weather event to account for all of them across that vast distance feels like forcing a square peg into a round hole. The walls, the roofs, and the rivers stand as permanent monuments to that gap between what we can explain and what was reported. They are the enduring knots in the story that no amount of historical combing has been able to fully untangle, preserving just enough of the supernatural aura to keep the legend alive and whispering. Devon was not alone in its terror. The phenomenon of impossible footprints is a ghost that has walked across the world, leaving its mark in snow, sand, and mud from one century to the next. Decades after the Devon panic, a strikingly similar mystery unfolded an ocean away. In the winter of 1909, the residents of Cape May, New Jersey, awoke to a bizarre scene. A single line of cloven hoofprints, almost identical to those in England, stretched for miles along the coastline. They appeared on frozen beaches, marched up the steps of porches, and even, according to some reports, approached the very doors of homes before mysteriously vanishing. The local newspapers immediately dubbed them the New Jersey Devil's footprints, linking them to the infamous local legend of the Leeds Devil, a mythical creature said to haunt the nearby pine barrens. The parallels were uncanny: a coastal community, a heavy winter, and the same visceral, cloven-hoofed signature provoking the same mixture of fear and bafflement. But the story does not end on the shores of the Atlantic. High in the Himalayas, for generations, Sherpas and mountaineers have reported a different kind of mysterious track. They speak of the Yeti, or the abominable snowman, and the long, single-file lines of large, human-like footprints found in remote snowfields at altitudes where no known primate could survive. While often dismissed as bear tracks or melting ice formations, these prints tap into the same deep well of mystery: the sudden appearance of a lone traveler's path in a vast, inhospitable wilderness. Even earlier, in 1840, the English newspaper The Times reported another set of mysterious tracks, this time in Scotland. Witnesses described a trail of hoof-like marks that seemed to emerge from the sea, travel overland, and then return to the water, as if something had come ashore for a nocturnal survey. When you lay these accounts side by side, a pattern emerges that is too compelling to ignore. We see the same essential ingredients: a pristine, blank landscape, usually after a snowfall, a single, relentless trail that defies normal animal behavior, and a shape, often cloven, that triggers immediate supernatural associations in the local culture. This global recurrence forces a critical question. Are we looking at evidence of a rare but real natural phenomenon, something that science has yet to fully categorize, that occurs independently around the world under specific conditions? Or does this pattern reveal something fundamental about the human mind, a universal tendency to project our oldest fears onto ambiguous marks in the snow? Perhaps the truth lies in the haunting space between the two, where a real, perplexing physical event meets our timeless need for a story. The human mind is a relentless pattern-making machine wired to find order in chaos. This deep-seated instinct, so crucial for survival, might also be the key that finally unlocks the enduring power of the devil's footprints. Modern psychology offers a compelling lens, not to explain the physical marks, but to explain the overwhelming consensus about what they were. At the heart of this is a phenomenon called pareidolia. This is our brain's automatic tendency to perceive a familiar pattern where none actually exists. We see a face in the clouds, a shape in the moon's shadows, or the Virgin Mary in a piece of toast. It is an unconscious shortcut, our neural circuitry filling in ambiguous information with a recognizable template. Now apply this to a snow-covered Devon landscape at dawn. The night's heavy fall, followed by a partial thaw and refreeze, would have created a complex pockmarked surface. Snowdrifts collapse, ice forms strange ridges, wind sculpts peculiar grooves. To a brain already primed by a culture rich with imagery of the cloven-hoofed devil, what might it see in those random, melted depressions? A series of elongated, vaguely split marks in a rough line could easily be assembled by the anxious mind into a perfect sequence of hoofprints. The expectation creates the perception. This is not a case of mass lying, but of mass interpretation. Fear is the catalyst that supercharges this process. In a state of high anxiety, our pattern seeking goes into overdrive, desperately trying to identify a threat. The initial, genuine confusion over some odd marks in the snow created a vacuum of meaning, and the collective psyche, steeped in folklore, rushed to fill it with the most culturally available and terrifying narrative available. One person, perhaps a respected farmer, might have voiced the dread first. "I think these look like the devil's own tracks." That single suggestion, uttered in a moment of shared uncertainty, could have acted like a psychic blueprint. From that point forward, as others went to look, their brains were no longer examining ambiguous shapes. They were looking for confirmation of the devil's hoof. Pareidolia ensured they found it. Every slightly cloven-shaped depression for miles around could be recruited into the grand, terrifying trail. The isolated, confusing marks reported in different parishes were mentally connected into one continuous, monstrous journey because the story demanded it. The legend did not form after the fact. It actively shaped the perception of the evidence in real time. This psychological perspective does not dismiss the witnesses, it empathizes with them. It reveals how a perfectly natural, if chaotic, canvas of winter weather could be transformed by fear and folklore into a single, coherent, and impossible story. The true footprint may not have been in the snow at all, but in the indelible stamp of human imagination. That psychological imprint proved far more permanent than any mark in the snow. From the terrified whispers of Victorian Devon, the story of the devil's footprints began a long migration into the very fabric of modern culture, transforming from a local panic into a global icon of the unexplained. Its first leap was into the pages of books, where authors of folklore and the paranormal seized upon it as a perfect case study. It became a staple in anthologies of strange phenomena, often presented as the quintessential example of a mass supernatural event with tangible, physical evidence. The tale was perfectly structured, a clear set of bizarre facts followed by a cascade of failed explanations, leaving the reader with a delicious, lingering chill. This literary journey ensured the mystery would be passed down to new generations, no longer reliant on local memory but preserved in print. The story truly entered the living rooms of the world with the dawn of television documentary series dedicated to the strange and mysterious. Perhaps most famously, it was featured in Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World in the 1980s. The renowned science fiction writer and futurist, a man who looked to the stars, found himself captivated by this earthly puzzle. The episode treated the Devon event with a blend of sober investigation and open wonder, presenting the eyewitness accounts, examining the historical records, and weighing the various theories without dismissing the profound oddity at its core. Clarke's global audience introduced the footprints to millions, cementing their status as a first-tier historical mystery. Today, the story thrives in the digital soil of the Internet. It is a perennial favorite on forums dedicated to cryptozoology, paranormal history, and unsolved mysteries. Online communities dissect the old newspaper scans, debate the badger theory versus the ball lightning hypothesis, and share modern-day accounts of similar strange tracks from around the world. The Devil's footprints have become a shared reference point, a common piece of evidence in a never-ending conversation about the limits of our understanding. For the county of Devon itself, the legend has been woven into the local identity. It is a point of darkly proud folklore, a story that distinguishes the region. You can find the tale recounted in local museum exhibits and historical society publications. In the towns and villages along the alleged path, curious visitors sometimes arrive, guidebooks in hand, hoping to trace the ghost of that impossible journey. Amateur sleuths walk the old lanes, trying to see the landscape through Victorian eyes, wondering if some overlooked clue still lingers in the quiet countryside. The footprints have transcended their origin to become a versatile narrative tool, used in everything from regional tourism to episodes of detective dramas seeking a Gothic backdrop. They persist because they represent the ideal mystery, one grounded enough to feel real, yet bizarre enough to defy any single, comfortable solution. They are not just a story about what walked through Devon, but a story about how we, as humans, grapple with the things we cannot explain, turning fear into folklore and a single night of panic into a legacy that walks on through the centuries. So what would a modern investigator do with this case, armed with tools the Victorians could not dream of? The first step would be to walk the ground, to retrace the ghost of that 100-mile path with a map in one hand and the old newspaper reports in the other. Today's landscape is both familiar and utterly changed. The high stone walls and thatched cottages still stand in places, but now they are framed by motorways, housing estates, and vast open farmland managed with machinery. An investigator would start at the reported origin near the River Exe, trying to see past the modern clutter to the open fields and narrow lanes of 1855. They would look for the enduring landmarks, the churches, the old manor houses, the specific bends in a river that were noted in the accounts. The goal would not be to find a physical footprint, but to understand the geography of the panic. How isolated was that farmstead? How high was that garden wall? Could a badger realistically find a passage under it, or does the stonework go deep into the earth? By walking the route, even in fragments, the sheer scale of the reported journey becomes viscerally real and the obstacles more concrete. The investigator might pause at a spot where the prints were said to cross a now paved road, trying to visualize the pristine snowfield that was once there, feeling the disconnect between the neat, documented mystery and the mundane reality of the present day. This act of retracing is a form of time travel, a way to bridge the century and a half that separates us from that frozen morning, asking the land itself if it holds any memory of the strange pilgrimage. But the walk would only be the beginning. The real power of a modern inquiry lies in technology invisible to the eye. Imagine deploying a drone equipped with LIDAR, a laser scanning system that can map the ground surface with incredible precision, even through light vegetation. Flying over the suspected route, LIDAR could create a three-dimensional model of the terrain, revealing subtle depressions, old footpaths, and the exact topography of walls and riverbanks. Could it detect some ancient fossilized pattern in the soil, some echo of disturbance? It is unlikely, but the technology allows us to ask the question with new rigor. More intriguing might be ground-penetrating radar, which sends pulses into the earth to image what lies beneath. While useless for finding footprints in long-melted snow, it could be used to examine the foundations of those walls, to search for the forgotten drains or animal burrows that might have provided a natural, if hidden, corridor. The investigator would, in essence, be conducting an archaeological survey on a legend, searching for the physical infrastructure that could support a rational explanation. They would also sit down with local historians in a Devon archive, the air smelling of old paper and dust. Here, they would not find a smoking gun, but they would find context. Parish records might show an unusual number of badgers culled that spring, a hint of a population boom. Weather logs could be cross-referenced to confirm the exact temperature and snow depth, testing the ice-shattering hypothesis against hard data. Old estate maps might reveal the location of a private menagerie long since vanished, reviving the escaped kangaroo theory with a specific, plausible source. The modern investigation becomes a collage, piecing together fragments from ecology, meteorology, and social history to build a profile of that night. Yet, after all this, the investigator would likely reach the same frustrating, fascinating point as every researcher before them. The tools can clarify the backdrop, they can shrink the realm of the impossible, but they cannot time travel back to that specific dawn to take a plaster cast of the prints. They are left with the same core evidence, now filtered through layers of time and storytelling, and the same enduring question. The landscape holds its secrets close, and the most advanced scan in the world cannot reveal what was only ever written in snow. Perhaps the deepest footprint left that night was not in the snow, but in the human spirit. The mystery of the devil's footprints endures not because it is the strangest story ever told, but because it is a perfect artifact, a frozen moment where history, psychology, and folklore collide with impeccable timing. Consider the precise ingredients. The year was 1855, a hinge point in human understanding. Charles Darwin was quietly preparing his theory of evolution, a seismic shock to religious certainty, yet in the villages of Devon, the old world still held its breath. This was a society perched on the edge of the modern age, still deeply superstitious but newly connected by rail and press. The event occurred in an isolated, rural landscape where tight-knit communities shared a common cultural language of demonic imagery. And then the catalyst, a blank canvas of snow upon which a single, terrifying symbol was stamped. The cloven hoof was not a vague shape, it was a loaded icon, a direct line to centuries of sermons and cautionary tales. The combination was volatile, a spark landing in perfectly prepared tinder. But the story's true power lies in what it represents for us today, in an age of satellites and search engines. We live in a world that feels increasingly mapped, explained, and demystified. Our phones can tell us the weather on the other side of the planet, and science can decode the building blocks of life. Yet, paradoxically, this flood of information can make a clean, elegant mystery like this one even more precious. It is a pocket of shadow in an overlit room. The devil's footprints offer a specific kind of thrill, the thrill of the unresolved. They present a set of facts that resist our modern compulsion to categorize and solve. We cannot swipe left on this mystery, we can only circle it, examining it from every angle, knowing a definitive answer may never come, and there is a strange comfort in that. The story taps into a fundamental human desire, not just for answers, but for the wonder of the question itself. It reminds us that the world, even in our age of reason, can still produce a narrative that defies our frameworks, a puzzle that humbles our certainty. The footprints are a relic from a time when the night could hold genuine, shapeless terror, but they speak to a timeless part of us that still wants to believe the map has edges, that there are still blank spaces where anything might be written, even if only for one frozen, silent night. The time has come to weigh the evidence and consider a verdict. Let us assemble a jury of our own reasoning and place the 4 leading theories on trial. First, the case for the badger. Its defense is built on solid, observable science. We have seen how its direct register gait can, in melting snow, create a single line of blurred, hoof-like impressions. The animal is common in Devon, active at night, and heavy enough to sink deep into a snowdrift. For the prosecution, the sheer distance is a fatal flaw. No badger walks 100 miles in a straight line without foraging or resting. The perfect 8-inch spacing contradicts an animal's natural, variable stride. Most damningly, the badger's lawyer has no answer for the rooftop accounts or the apparent passages through solid walls. The verdict on the badger theory is plausible for the shape of the prints, but not for the epic scope of their journey. Next, we call the hopping rodent hypothesis to the stand. Its argument is one of perception and erosion. A chain of small creatures leaping through snow could, after morning melting and sublimation, create a continuous groove mistaken for footprints. The weakness here is one of scale and physics. Coordinating thousands of mice across an entire county is impossible, and their light weight could never produce the deep, weighty stamps described by witnesses. This theory evaporates when asked to explain the trail over a frozen river or a garden wall. The jury finds it an inventive but insufficient explanation for the physical evidence. Now the weather takes the stand. The defense for ball lightning or a freak whirlwind points to their ability to ignore physical barriers and create strange marks. A dancing electrical phenomenon could skip over a roof, a vortex could cross a wall. Yet these events are chaotic by nature. They do not march in a straight, disciplined line for 100 miles, nor do they leave neat, cloven-shaped impressions thousands of times in a row. Snow rollers might create a trough, but not on a thatched roof. The weather theory is acquitted of being the sole culprit, though it may have been an accomplice in shaping the panic. Finally, we must judge the possibility of a grand hoax. The idea of a human prankster appeals to our sense of mischief, but the logistics are a prosecutor's dream. The stamina, secrecy, and precise local knowledge required to stamp a trail of that length in one night, without leaving a single human footprint or being seen, borders on the superhuman. The lack of any confession or uncovered plot after 170 years of scrutiny is a powerful testament to its improbability. While we cannot rule out localized trickery, a county-wide conspiracy is dismissed as untenable. So, what is the final verdict of our inquiry? If we must choose the most scientifically plausible explanation, the badge stands as the strongest candidate. It provides a clear, natural mechanism for creating the core visual, the hoof-like mark in the snow. Yet, to declare the case closed on this basis feels like a compromise. We are asked to accept that dozens of separate badgers, in a bizarre coincidence, each created a segment of a perfectly aligned trail, and that generations of witnesses profoundly misinterpreted the landscape around them. The badger theory satisfies the need for a rational anchor, but it leaves the deepest parts of the mystery, the scale, and the strangest testimonies floating just out of reach. This is the enduring power of the devil's footprints. They offer us a choice between a comfortable, incomplete answer and the haunting, unresolved wonder of a night when the impossible left its calling card in the snow. That final, unanswerable question is what keeps the legend alive. On a frozen February night in 1855, a deep and silent snow fell across the English county of Devon. By morning, that pristine canvas bore a message no one could read, a single, continuous trail of cloven hoofprints that marched for nearly 100 miles. This impossible path flowed over rooftops, through solid walls, and across frozen rivers, defying every law of the natural world. The discovery triggered a wave of pure, visceral panic. Farmers took up arms, families barred their doors, and an entire region became convinced the devil himself had walked among them. In the centuries since, the debate has never ceased. Scientists have pointed to badgers and ball lightning, historians have sifted through yellowed newspapers, and psychologists have analyzed the contagion of fear. Yet each theory, while illuminating a piece of the puzzle, fails to capture the whole. The true legacy of the Devil's Footprints lies not in a solution but in the enduring power of the story. It is a perfect snapshot, frozen in time, of a society caught between superstition and science. It captures the Victorian mind with its deep currents of religious dread and its burgeoning hunger for rational explanation, colliding headlong with something utterly inexplicable. This event lives on because it exists in that fascinating borderland where verifiable history bleeds into folklore, where a set of physical facts becomes a mirror for our deepest curiosities and fears. The snow melted in a matter of days, but the impression it left is permanent. So we leave you with the same question that has haunted Devon for over 170 years, the question that began with a whisper on a cold morning and now echoes through history. What do you think left those prints in the snow? Share your theory in the comments